Hey guys, when Rome won a war, it didn't just take land. It took people, symbols, and stories. And few symbols mattered more than a defeated queen. In the Roman imagination, a captured queen wasn't only a prisoner of war. She was proof that the gods, the legions, and the Roman state had triumphed over an entire people. Before we get into it, a quick, quiet reminder. If you enjoy long-form, carefully researched history that's meant to be listened to and lived with, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so these deeper dives keep finding them when they're ready for the next story. Now, to understand how Rome really punished captured queens, we need to start with a Roman assumption that shaped everything. Rome believed victory had to be made visible. Conquest wasn't complete when the fighting stopped. It was complete when the conquered world accepted that Rome could define reality, who had power, who had legitimacy, and who would be remembered with honor or humiliation. A queen, after all, was not merely a political leader. She was often tied to sacred authority, dynastic continuity, and the pride of a nation. If Rome could break that figure in public, Rome could break the idea that resistance had meaning. The most famous stage for this was the Roman triumph. In theory, it was a religious procession thanking the gods for victory. In practice, it was a carefully choreographed statement. Rome's general elevated for a day almost to a kingly status. Ironically, the very thing Romans claimed to hate. Paraded through the city with spoils, captives, and evidence of dominion. In that procession, a captured queen could be displayed as the climax of foreign submission. The point wasn't simply to punish her. It was to educate the crowd. Look at what happens to those who stand against Rome. Look at what Rome can do to the mighty. But Rome's punishments were not always blunt. They were strategic. Roman leaders asked a cold question. What is more useful, death, captivity, or survival under Roman terms? The answer changed from case to case, and it depended on politics in Rome as much as it depended on the queen herself. Sometimes the queen's life could be leveraged to stabilize a region. Sometimes her death could erase a rival claim. Sometimes keeping her alive, but stripped of power, could serve as a permanent warning. One of the clearest examples is Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Not because she was marched in chains through Rome, she wasn't, but because her end shows Rome's preferred outcome, control of the narrative. Cleopatra understood what capture meant. In the Roman political world, to be taken alive was to be converted into a symbol, a spectacle, a living trophy. When Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, he needed Egypt. He also needed legitimacy at home. Cleopatra, as queen, was dangerous in two ways. First, she represented an alternative center of wealth and authority. Second, she could be used by Octavian's enemies in Rome as a rallying point. A living reminder that Octavian's victory was not inevitable. Cleopatra's death prevented the triumphal display Octavian likely wanted, but it also allowed him to shape her story without her presence. He could frame her not as a sovereign defending her realm, but as an exotic threat, an outsider whose influence had supposedly corrupted a Roman man. Rome's punishment here was not a chain or a prison cell. It was something that lasted longer. A political portrait circulated through speeches, imagery, and memory, in which Cleopatra became a warning about foreign power, female authority, and the risks of divided Roman loyalty. If Cleopatra shows us how Rome used narrative, Zenobia of Palmyra shows us how Rome used survival. In the 3rd century, when the empire was strained by civil war, invasions, and economic upheaval, Zenobia rose as the effective ruler behind the Palmyrene state, expanding her control over parts of the eastern provinces and Egypt. To Rome, she was not simply rebelling. She was claiming the right to rule. When Emperor Aurelian defeated her, the Roman response had to do 2 things at once. It had to reassert imperial authority, and it had to persuade the eastern provinces that the Roman center still had the strength to command obedience. Capturing Zenobia achieved that. She could be displayed as proof that even a successful, charismatic ruler could be reduced to a prisoner. Yet sources also suggest she may have been spared and lived out her days in Italy in a kind of controlled respectability, neither free nor publicly destroyed. If that's true, it reveals the most Roman kind of punishment, the conversion of a sovereign into a dependent. Rome's message would be, your queen lives, but only because Rome allows it and only under Rome's gaze. For the provinces, the lesson was submission. For Rome, it was reassurance. The empire could still absorb challengers and turn them into evidence of imperial stability. Now, it's tempting to imagine Roman punishment as purely cruel theater, but the deeper pattern is bureaucratic and political. Queens were not treated as ordinary prisoners because they were not ordinary political actors. Their bodies, families, and reputations were instruments of state. Rome punished captured queens by dismantling the structures that made them queens. Their claim to command, their ability to distribute wealth, their sacred or dynastic aura, and their role as the living future of a kingdom. This is why Roman punishments often included taking children or relatives as hostages, relocating households, and reorganizing territories. A queen's captivity was frequently paired with administrative surgery. Client kings installed, local elites courted, armies disbanded, taxes redirected, and temples brought under new influence. The queen herself was only one part of the operation, but she was the part everyone could see. We can see the public dimension most clearly in the triumphal tradition. For a defeated royal, the triumph was both humiliation and a kind of political death. You were still alive, but your authority had been consumed by the victor's story. The crowd did not need to hear a legal verdict. The procession itself was the verdict. Foreign titles, queen, king, prince, were displayed as empty costumes. The captive became a moving caption beneath Rome's glory. Even when the captive was treated with a degree of material care, the purpose remained the same, to show that Rome owned the outcome. Yet Rome's relationship with queens was complicated by Roman ideas about gender and power. Roman elites could admire a formidable enemy even as they condemned her. That admiration often took a particular shape. A queen could be praised for courage, intelligence, or discipline, but only in a way that ultimately reinforced Roman dominance. If she was strong, Rome's victory looked greater. If she was portrayed as immoral or manipulative, Rome's victory looked morally necessary. Either way, the Roman lens centered Rome. The queen's real motives, protecting autonomy, defending a dynasty, resisting exploitation, could be flattened into whatever story served the moment. And this is where the punishment becomes real, in a sense that goes beyond chains or exile. Rome punished captured queens by deciding how they would be remembered. In a world where most written history that survived was produced by Roman authors or under Roman influence, the defeated often lost control of their own meaning. The queen who fought for her people might be preserved as a cautionary tale. The queen who negotiated might be dismissed as weak. The queen who resisted might be sexualized, caricatured, or moralized. Rome's victory did not end with the battlefield, continued through the archive. At the same time, it's important to say this calmly and clearly. Rome did not always treat captured royal women the same way, and that variation tells us something about Rome itself. The Republic and the Empire were political systems where public opinion, elite rivalry, and personal prestige mattered intensely. A general who returned to Rome needed more than military success. He needed a story that elevated him above his peers. A captured queen could become a political asset in that competition. In some cases, the queen's fate might be decided less by her own actions than by the victor's needs. Is the general trying to look merciful? Is he trying to look uncompromising? Does he need to reassure the Senate? Does he need to intimidate a restive frontier? The queen's punishment, in other words, was often tailored to an audience, Rome. And that brings us to the central truth behind the title. Rome's punishment of captured queens was rarely about revenge alone. It was about control of populations, control of legitimacy, and control of the story Rome told about itself. To capture a queen was to capture a symbol. To punish her was to transform that symbol into a Roman possession. In the next part, we'll move from the broad pattern to the mechanisms Rome used again and again. The triumph as a theater of domination, imprisonment as political storage, exile as slow erasure, and selective mercy as a way to turn resistance into dependency. And we'll look at how these choices shaped not only the queen's lives, but the future of the regions Rome absorbed, because in Roman history, the fate of a captured queen was never just personal. It was policy performed in public. If we look closely at the Roman triumph, we begin to see how carefully engineered this punishment really was. A triumph was not granted automatically. The Senate had to approve it, and approval meant that Rome officially recognized the victory as worthy of celebration. That recognition transformed the defeated enemy into a prop within a sacred civic ritual. When a captured queen appeared in that procession, she was positioned within a hierarchy that left no ambiguity. First came the spoils: gold, artwork, weapons, and exotic treasures. Then came prisoners, often in chains. Finally came the victorious general in a chariot, dressed in garments associated with Jupiter, the king of the gods. The visual message was unmistakable. Divine favor rested with Rome. For a queen, this was a profound inversion. She may once have presided over her own court, issued decrees, commanded armies, and received ambassadors. Now she walked through foreign streets while strangers watched in silence or celebration. The punishment was psychological as much as political. Rome did not merely defeat her forces. It displaced her from the center of power to the margins of spectacle. The crowd's gaze was part of the sentence. Yet execution was not always immediate. In some cases, high-profile captives were held in custody, sometimes in conditions that were controlled but not necessarily brutal. Rome understood that killing a queen too quickly could remove a bargaining tool. A living royal captive could be used to negotiate with surviving factions in her homeland. She could discourage rebellion by existing as proof that Rome held ultimate authority. At times, Roman leaders preferred a long-term solution: relocation to Italy under supervision. This was a quieter punishment, but in many ways it was deeper. Exile severed a queen from the rituals, landscapes, and institutions that had given her power. Without her court, without her army, without her religious context, she was a sovereign without sovereignty. Zenobia's case illustrates this strategic balance. After her defeat, Aurelian needed stability in the East. A dramatic execution might have satisfied some audiences, but it could also have fueled resentment in recently reconquered provinces. By reportedly sparing her and integrating her into Roman society under controlled conditions, Aurelian demonstrated strength combined with clemency. Roman mercy, however, always reinforced hierarchy. If Zenobia lived in Italy, it was not as a rival monarch. It was as a dependent of the emperor, a living reminder that even ambitious rulers could be absorbed into the Roman order. Cleopatra's end, by contrast, reveals how threatening a queen could be if allowed to stand as a symbol of resistance. Octavian understood that parading her in a triumph would elevate his glory, but he also understood the risk. Cleopatra was not an obscure regional leader. She was tied to Mark Antony, one of Rome's most powerful men, and to a narrative of Roman civil conflict. Allowing her to appear publicly could create sympathy or stir political tensions. Her suicide removed that possibility. In death, she could be simplified into a cautionary tale. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, could claim that he had rescued Rome from dangerous foreign influence and restored stability. The punishment here extended beyond her lifetime. Roman writers shaped her memory to fit a broader moral framework about discipline, loyalty, and Roman virtue. Across these examples, one pattern remains steady. Rome punished captured queens by redefining their identity. Once sovereign, they became prisoners. Once central, they became peripheral. Once authors of policy, they became objects within someone else's political theater. Even when treated with a degree of outward respect, the essential transformation was irreversible. Rome did not allow a captured queen to remain a queen in anything but title, and this transformation served a larger purpose. In frontier regions and newly conquered territories, news of a queen's fate traveled quickly. Stories of public display, exile, or controlled survival circulated through merchants, soldiers, and local elites. The message was clear: Rome could reach the highest levels of your society. No title was beyond its grasp. No crown was immune. Another important dimension of Rome's treatment of captured queens was the legal and symbolic stripping of status. In Roman political culture, rank mattered deeply. Titles, garments, seating positions in public ceremonies, even the order in which names were spoken, all of these signaled hierarchy. When a queen was captured, Rome did not simply confine her body, It dismantled the framework that recognized her authority. She was no longer addressed as a sovereign equal. She was classified as a captive of the Roman people. That distinction was more than semantics. It meant her power was not paused. It was annulled. In many cases, members of her household were separated from her. Advisors, family members, military commanders, and attendants could be detained, sold, relocated, or absorbed into Roman service. This fragmentation prevented any quick reassembly of a rival court. It also demonstrated Rome's reach into the intimate spaces of foreign governance. A monarchy depends not only on one person, but on a network of loyalty. By dispersing that network, Rome made it clear that sovereignty itself had been confiscated. Hostages were another mechanism tied closely to royal punishment. Even when a queen was not executed or displayed in a triumph, her children or close relatives might be taken to Rome. Officially, hostages were a guarantee of good behavior. In practice, they were instruments of long-term influence. Raised in Roman culture, educated in Latin, trained in Roman customs, these royal children could later be installed as client rulers who were psychologically and politically aligned with Rome. The punishment of one generation became the reshaping of the next. A captured queen might lose not only her throne, but also control over her dynasty's future. There was also the matter of property. Royal treasuries were prime targets after conquest. Gold, silver, art, ceremonial regalia. These were transported to Rome and displayed. The economic blow weakened any chance of organized resistance, but it also enriched the Roman state and the victorious general. In triumphal processions, the wealth of a defeated queen symbolized Rome's ability to convert foreign resources into Roman prosperity. Temples might be rededicated. Palaces might be repurposed. Administrative centers could be reorganized under Roman governors. In this way, punishment extended beyond the individual and into the landscape of power itself. It is important to understand that Rome rarely acted from pure emotion in these matters. Anger, pride, and rivalry certainly played roles, especially among ambitious generals. But the larger system was pragmatic. Roman leaders constantly weighed risks. Would executing a queen provoke revolt? Would sparing her encourage future rebellion by appearing weak? Would public humiliation strengthen political standing back in Rome? Each decision was calculated within a web of military necessity and domestic competition. And over time, these choices accumulated into precedent. The Roman world learned what capture meant. Foreign rulers understood that defiance carried not only military danger but also personal transformation into a Roman symbol. Queens, in particular, occupied a delicate position. As female rulers in a male-dominated Roman worldview, they were often described as unusual or even unnatural figures of authority. That portrayal could intensify the drama of their defeat. Roman authors sometimes emphasized their ambition or influence to heighten the sense of restored order after their fall. The subtext was clear. Rome had corrected a disruption, yet behind the rhetoric, a quieter truth emerges. Rome feared legitimacy that did not flow from Rome. A queen who commanded loyalty, wealth, and sacred authority outside Roman structures represented an alternative center of gravity. Capturing her was not simply about punishing rebellion. It was about absorbing or neutralizing that alternative. In doing so, Rome reinforced a central message that echoed across centuries. Sovereignty ultimately belonged to the Roman state. All other crowns existed at its pleasure or at its risk. As the Roman Republic transitioned into the empire, the symbolism surrounding captured royalty became even more refined. Under the emperors, victory was no longer simply the achievement of an ambitious general seeking prestige. It was proof that the emperor himself stood at the center of divine favor and global order. When a queen was captured during the imperial period, her fate was woven into a larger ideological framework. Rome as the stabilizing force of the known world. The emperor's image appeared on coins, monuments, and public inscriptions that celebrated victories. If a foreign queen had been subdued, that fact might be represented indirectly through titles such as Restorer of the East or Conqueror of Egypt. The queen herself did not need to be described in detail. Her defeat was absorbed into the emperor's expanding identity. In this way, the punishment extended beyond the moment of capture and into the architecture of memory. Every time a coin changed hands or a citizen walked past a triumphal arch, the message endured. Resistance had been overcome, order restored. Roman imprisonment also had its own hierarchy. Not all captives were thrown into dark cells indefinitely. High-ranking prisoners were often held in guarded residences or specific state facilities, particularly if their survival served political purposes. Yet even in relatively stable conditions, captivity imposed isolation. Removed from familiar language, advisors, and ritual life, a queen existed in suspension. She was neither fully integrated nor entirely erased. Rome excelled at maintaining such controlled ambiguity. The captive's very existence testified to Roman supremacy, but her lack of agency ensured she could not meaningfully challenge it. Over time, some captured royal women were absorbed into Roman aristocratic networks through arranged marriages or carefully supervised social integration. While this might appear merciful, it represented a subtle but profound transformation. Marriage into Roman society diluted independent dynastic identity. Children born into such unions would identify primarily as Roman elites, not as heirs to a separate sovereign tradition. The original monarchy dissolved gradually into Roman nobility. Punishment here operated not through spectacle, but through assimilation. It is also worth considering the economic dimension of these policies. Provinces once ruled by queens were reorganized under Roman administrative systems. Taxation was standardized, land surveys conducted, and garrisons installed. Local elites were offered positions within Roman governance structures in exchange for loyalty. By combining political restructuring with the visible fate of the defeated queen, Rome linked abstract policy to concrete example. The people could see what had happened to their ruler, and they could see the new officials taking her place. The transition from independence to provincial status became tangible. Roman writers often framed these events within moral narratives. A queen who resisted Rome might be portrayed as overly ambitious or driven by excessive pride. Her defeat then served as a lesson about the dangers of challenging Roman destiny. But beneath this literary framing lay a consistent strategic logic. Rome sought predictability. A captured queen represented unpredictability neutralized. Her authority had once mobilized armies and inspired loyalty. Now that authority was redefined as subordinate or extinguished, there is a striking consistency across centuries in how Rome balanced severity with calculation. Public humiliation demonstrated dominance. Selective mercy demonstrated confidence. Exile prevented martyrdom in the homeland. Execution eliminated long-term risk. Assimilation transformed former enemies into participants in Roman society. These were not random outcomes. They were tools within a broader imperial toolkit. Ultimately, when we ask how Rome really punished captured queens, the answer is layered. Rome punished them physically at times, politically always, and symbolically without exception. The visible acts, chains, processions, guarded residences, were only part of the story. The deeper punishment was the removal of independent legitimacy and the absorption of their narrative into Rome's own story of inevitability. And this approach helps explain why Roman power endured as long as it did. By turning defeated rulers into demonstrations of authority, Rome converted victory into education. Every captured queen became a message broadcast across the empire. Rome does not merely defeat its rivals. It decides what their defeat means. There is also a deeper cultural layer to this story, one that reveals as much about Rome as it does about the queens it subdued. Roman political identity was built on a paradox. Romans despised the idea of kingship within their own system, proudly recalling the expulsion of their last king in the early republic. Yet abroad, they constantly confronted monarchies, kingdoms ruled by men and, at times, by powerful women. When Rome captured a queen, it was not only defeating a foreign enemy, it was confronting a form of authority Romans claimed to reject, yet continuously absorbed into their empire. This tension shaped how captured queens were presented to Roman audiences. They could be portrayed as embodiments of excess, luxury, emotional rule, personal ambition, contrasted against Rome's supposed discipline and collective governance. By emphasizing these traits, Roman authors reinforced a comforting narrative. Rome's system was superior because it restrained individual power. The queen's fall became proof that monarchy, especially when embodied in a strong female ruler, was unstable when measured against Roman order. At the same time, Rome was pragmatic enough to rely on client monarchies throughout its territories. Not every region was converted immediately into a province. Many were ruled indirectly through local kings and queens who pledged loyalty to Rome. This makes the punishment of captured queens even more strategic. Rome had to demonstrate that loyalty would be rewarded, while defiance would be unmistakably costly. The visible fate of one ruler served as a warning to others who governed at Rome's pleasure. Consider how carefully Rome handled transitions of power after a queen's defeat. In some cases, a relative who was more cooperative with Roman interests would be elevated. In others, the territory would be reorganized under direct imperial administration. The queen's removal was rarely an isolated event. It was accompanied by treaties, military deployments, and economic restructuring. Roman punishment was therefore embedded within statecraft. It reshaped entire political landscapes. Public memory played a crucial role as well. Monuments, inscriptions, and official histories were not neutral records. They curated Rome's version of events. A queen who had once inspired loyalty among her people might appear in Roman accounts as reckless or misguided. Over time, these portrayals could overshadow local traditions, especially as Roman cultural influence expanded. In this way, punishment extended into historical consciousness. Rome did not only conquer territories, it influenced how those territories would be remembered. And yet, despite Rome's efforts to control the narrative, the very fact that names like Cleopatra and Zenobia still resonate today suggests something interesting. Roman sources sought to frame their stories within Roman priorities, but the endurance of these queens' legacies hints at their resilience. Even in defeat, they remained significant enough to be recorded, debated, and revisited. The attempt to convert them into symbols of Roman triumph also preserved them within global history. From a broader perspective, Rome's treatment of captured queens reveals an empire deeply aware of optics. Authority had to be seen. Punishment had to communicate. Mercy had to reinforce hierarchy rather than undermine it. Each captured queen stood at the intersection of military success and political messaging. Her fate was shaped not only by what she had done, but by what Rome needed to project at that moment. In the end, Rome's real punishment was transformation. A queen who once stood at the center of her own world was repositioned within Rome's world. Her autonomy was replaced by Roman oversight. Her story was reframed within Roman ideology. Whether through triumphal display, guarded exile, execution, or assimilation, the consistent outcome was the same. Sovereignty shifted irreversibly toward Rome. And that is perhaps the clearest answer to the question. Rome did not punish captured queens randomly or purely out of cruelty. It punished them in ways that strengthened Roman authority, stabilized contested regions, and reinforced the empire's image of inevitability. In doing so, Rome demonstrated a principle that defined its expansion for centuries. Power was not only about winning battles. It was about shaping what victory looked like and ensuring the world never forgot who had defined it. If we step back and look at the wider imperial system, one final pattern becomes clear. Rome's treatment of captured queens was part of a larger philosophy of domination that combined ritual, law, military force, and storytelling into a single framework. Rome did not rely on one method alone. It layered consequences. A military defeat was followed by political reclassification, economic absorption, social restructuring, and narrative control. By the time the process was complete, the former queen's world no longer existed in its previous form. In practical terms, this meant that once a queen was captured, her kingdom ceased to function as an independent decision-making body. Administrative authority shifted quickly. Roman governors, procurators, or military commanders assumed oversight. Census operations were often conducted to measure taxable resources. Infrastructure such as roads and fortifications was expanded to integrate the territory into imperial logistics. The queen's personal removal symbolized this transfer of sovereignty, but the deeper shift occurred in institutions. Rome excelled at turning conquest into system. There was also a religious dimension. Many queens held roles intertwined with sacred authority. They participated in rituals that linked monarchy with divine favor. Rome understood the psychological importance of this connection. When a queen was paraded in a triumph or publicly displayed as defeated, it signaled not only political failure but divine displacement. Roman triumphs themselves were religious ceremonies dedicated to Jupiter. The underlying message was subtle but powerful. The Roman gods had prevailed. Even if local populations continued their traditions, the symbolic hierarchy had shifted. Importantly, Rome's restraint in certain cases was not weakness but calculated messaging. An emperor who spared a captured queen could present himself as magnanimous, confident enough in his supremacy that mercy posed no threat. This reinforced the image of Rome as a civilizing power rather than a destructive one. At the same time, the queen's survival under Roman supervision reminded everyone that clemency depended entirely on imperial discretion. Mercy was conditional, not equal. For Roman citizens, these events reinforced collective identity. News of distant victories traveled through inscriptions, public announcements, coins, and celebrations. The defeat of a foreign queen confirmed Rome's expanding horizon. It reassured citizens that threats were contained and that imperial leadership was effective. In times of internal instability, such victories were especially valuable. They redirected attention outward and strengthened loyalty to the central authority. Yet beneath the imperial confidence, there was always an awareness of fragility. The Roman world was vast and diverse. Revolts could erupt. Armies could proclaim rival emperors. Frontier pressures could intensify. In that context, the handling of a captured queen was not simply about her. It was about preventing future resistance. Rome aimed to demonstrate that opposition would not produce heroic martyrdom or negotiated equality. It would produce transformation, absorption into a hierarchy where Rome defined the terms. Over centuries, this approach contributed to Rome's longevity. By integrating conquered elites, sometimes through punishment, sometimes through cooperation, Rome reduced the number of permanent enemies. A defeated royal house might vanish, but its former territories often became stable contributors to the empire. Trade expanded. Local aristocrats entered Roman political networks. Urban development accelerated under imperial sponsorship. The original queen's removal marked the end of one chapter, but Rome sought to ensure it marked the beginning of another aligned with Roman interests. And still, the personal dimension should not be overlooked. Behind the policies and processions were individuals who had once commanded loyalty and shaped their societies. Their capture represented a dramatic reversal of fortune. Rome's system excelled at absorbing that reversal into a broader narrative of inevitability. The empire presented itself as the final arbiter of legitimacy. Crowns could be granted or removed. Sovereignty could be tolerated or revoked. The captured queen embodied this principle in human form. So when we ask how Rome really punished captured queens, the fullest answer is this: Rome dismantled their sovereignty at every level: public, political, economic, religious, and historical. Sometimes the punishment was visible and ceremonial. Sometimes it was quiet and administrative. But in every case, it reinforced the same message. Rome stood at the center of power, and all other authority existed in relation to it. In the end, the fate of these queens reveals something fundamental about Roman rule. Conquest was never only about territory. It was about redefining reality. A queen who once symbolized independence became evidence of Roman dominance. Her defeat was displayed, recorded, and integrated into the imperial story. Through her transformation, Rome reminded the world that victory did not end with the battlefield. It ended when Rome decided what that victory meant, and ensured that meaning endured long after the procession had passed. As we draw the lens even wider, we begin to see that Rome's treatment of captured queens was not an improvised reaction to individual rebellions. It was consistent with a long Roman habit of converting rivals into lessons. From early encounters in Italy to confrontations across North Africa and the Near East, Roman expansion depended on establishing a predictable pattern. Resist, be defeated, be reclassified. Queens, because of their symbolic weight, made that pattern especially visible. In the Roman worldview, power flowed from the Roman people and, later, from the emperor as the embodiment of that people's authority. Any ruler outside that structure existed in a conditional space. Friendly monarchs were allies and friends of Rome. That phrasing alone implied hierarchy. It suggested that sovereignty was acknowledged, but only within limits defined by Roman interests. When a queen crossed those limits by expanding territory without approval, withholding tribute, or aligning with Rome's rivals, the response was framed not as aggression but as correction. This language of correction is important. Roman authors frequently described wars against foreign rulers as efforts to restore order or defend stability. A captured queen could thus be portrayed not as a legitimate sovereign defending her realm, but as a disruptive figure whose removal benefited the wider world. That framing reduced sympathy and justified harsh outcomes. Even when a queen had strong domestic support, Roman narratives positioned her defeat as necessary for peace. There was also an educational effect within the Roman elite. Young aristocrats who witnessed triumphs or read accounts of captured royalty absorbed lessons about ambition and caution. They saw that Rome rewarded decisive action but also demanded loyalty to the center. A victorious general who mishandled a captive queen, by appearing too cruel or too lenient, could face criticism at home. The spectacle of punishment therefore reinforced norms within Rome itself. It demonstrated how power should be displayed and controlled. At the provincial level, the consequences were more immediate. Once a queen was removed, Rome often invested in urban development to anchor its presence. Cities were granted new legal statuses. Local councils were reorganized under Roman law. Infrastructure projects connected former royal capitals to imperial trade routes. These measures created economic incentives for cooperation. The memory of the queen's capture lingered, but daily life gradually aligned with Roman systems. punishment transitioned into integration. It is worth noting that Rome rarely allowed a defeated queen to return to independent rule, even in a reduced capacity. The risk of renewed loyalty around her name was too great. Instead, Rome preferred substitution. Either a more compliant relative was installed, or the territory was absorbed directly. This refusal to restore sovereignty highlights a core Roman principle. Authority, once challenged and subdued, was not casually reinstated. To do so would undermine the demonstration of supremacy. And yet, Rome's strategy was not built solely on fear. It balanced deterrence with opportunity. Formerly independent regions could prosper under imperial stability. Trade networks expanded dramatically across the Mediterranean. Local elites who cooperated often gained access to Roman citizenship, military careers, and political advancement. The fall of a queen did not necessarily mean the permanent marginalization of her people. Instead, it marked a shift in alignment. The costs of resistance were made clear, but so were the potential benefits of accommodation. Over time, this blend of punishment and absorption created a layered imperial identity. Conquered territories retained aspects of their culture while operating within Roman frameworks. The memory of defeated queens survived in local traditions and Roman histories alike, sometimes recast in different tones. To Rome, their stories confirmed imperial destiny. To others, they could represent lost independence or enduring resilience. The very act of punishment, meant to assert finality, preserved their significance. In the end, the Roman approach to captured queens reveals an empire deeply invested in perception as much as power. Military victory removed immediate threats. Political restructuring secured long-term control. Public display communicated dominance. Narrative shaping defined meaning. Each layer reinforced the others. The queen's fate was never isolated from the broader system. So when we look back calmly and without exaggeration, the answer becomes clear. Rome punished captured queens by dismantling the structures that sustained their rule and by repurposing their image to strengthen Roman authority. Whether through triumphal humiliation, controlled exile, strategic mercy, or permanent absorption into Roman society, the objective remained constant. Rome ensured that the crown they once wore could never again function outside Rome's shadow, and that, more than any single dramatic moment, is what defined the reality behind the spectacle. Rome did not simply defeat queens. It redefined them, turning symbols of independent power into enduring evidence of imperial control. There is one final dimension worth considering, and it brings us closer to the human reality behind imperial policy. For Rome, the punishment of a captured queen was a statement about hierarchy. For the queen herself, it was the collapse of a lifetime of preparation. Many royal women were educated from childhood to rule, trained in diplomacy, ritual, languages, and the management of court politics. They were accustomed to being the axis around which decisions turned. Capture replaced that axis with silence. Roman custody, whether in a guarded residence, a villa in Italy, or a state facility, imposed a controlled existence. Communication was monitored. Movement was restricted. Visitors were limited. Even if material conditions were not severe, the absence of agency was profound. A queen who had once commanded armies now required permission to travel or correspond. This transformation was deliberate. Rome did not merely wish to prevent escape. It intended to display the transfer of control. At the same time, Roman authorities were careful not to create unnecessary martyrs. An execution carried risks. It could inspire loyalty among the defeated population or create a rallying symbol for future resistance. The memory of a slain queen might ignite stories of sacrifice and injustice. By contrast, a living but politically neutralized former ruler could fade gradually from active relevance. Exile functioned as a slow diminishment. Without public rituals, without the daily reinforcement of authority, even powerful identities could erode over time. Roman emperors also understood the importance of comparison. By sparing or punishing different rulers in different ways, they signaled standards. A cooperative monarch might retain limited authority. A defiant one might lose everything. This pattern encouraged calculation among Rome's neighbors. Queens ruling client states knew that their survival depended on balancing local autonomy with visible loyalty to Rome. The fate of those who misjudged that balance was not hidden. There is also a legal aspect to consider. Roman law gradually expanded to encompass conquered territories. When a queen was deposed, her lands and resources could be classified as public property of the Roman state. Confiscation was not framed as theft but as lawful acquisition following war. This legal language reinforced the idea that Rome's dominance operated within a system of order, even when imposed through force. The punishment of royalty thus became normalized within Roman jurisprudence. Over generations, these practices shaped the empire's political culture. Provincial elites adapted to Roman expectations. Loyalty ceremonies, oaths, and formal acknowledgments of imperial authority became routine. The dramatic capture of a queen might be remembered for years, but the administrative absorption that followed ensured long-term stability. Rome excelled at making extraordinary events serve ordinary governance. And yet, history reminds us that power is rarely absolute. The very need to parade captured queens, to narrate their defeat, to inscribe victory on arches and coins, reveals an awareness of vulnerability. Rome's leaders understood that legitimacy required reinforcement. Spectacle was a tool of reassurance. Each displayed triumph declared that the imperial order remained intact. For modern audiences, these stories resonate because they illuminate the mechanics of empire. They show how authority is performed as much as exercised. They reveal how political systems convert individuals into symbols. The queens themselves, Cleopatra, Zenobia, and others whose names are less widely remembered, stood at the crossroads of personal ambition and imperial expansion. Their fates were shaped not only by their choices but by the strategic priorities of the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world. So, in the quietest sense, Rome's real punishment was not always immediate suffering. It was redefinition. A queen ceased to exist as an independent center of power and became a chapter in Rome's narrative of supremacy. Her court dissolved into provincial administration. Her treasury flowed into Roman coffers. her alliances unraveled into imperial oversight. Even her memory was filtered through Roman interpretation. And that is why the question endures. How did Rome really punish captured queens? It did so comprehensively, through ceremony and law, through exile and assimilation, through economic restructuring and historical storytelling. Rome ensured that no rival crown could survive unchanged. The punishment was not only about ending resistance. It was about proving again and again that in the Roman world, sovereignty ultimately belonged to Rome, and that any challenge to that claim would be absorbed, displayed, and remembered on Roman terms. If we bring everything together, a final pattern emerges, one that explains why Rome's approach to captured queens was so consistent across centuries and so effective in reinforcing imperial authority. Rome understood something fundamental about power. Legitimacy is as important as force. Armies could win battles, but symbols won obedience. A queen represented concentrated legitimacy. She embodied continuity, sacred sanction, dynastic memory, and often the emotional loyalty of her people. Removing her from power was not enough. Rome needed to demonstrate that her legitimacy had transferred or dissolved. This is why public ritual mattered so deeply. The triumph was not simply celebration. It was political theater with religious overtones. The Roman crowd watching a defeated queen pass through the streets was witnessing a reversal of cosmic order. The general rode in a chariot dressed in garments associated with Jupiter. The implication was unmistakable. The gods favored Rome. The queen's fall was not random. It was confirmation of a hierarchy that placed Rome at the center of the world. But Rome also understood the limits of spectacle. Once the procession ended, governance began. The territory formerly ruled by that queen had to function. Taxes had to be collected. Trade had to continue. Local elites had to decide whether to resist or cooperate. Here, Rome's punishment strategy became quieter and more systematic. Administrative integration replaced royal decree. Roman law replaced local sovereign judgment in key areas. Garrisons ensured security. Over time, daily life adjusted to the new order. In many cases, Rome's greatest punishment was permanence. A defeated queen might hope that her capture was temporary, that negotiations, alliances, or shifts in fortune could restore her authority. Rome worked to eliminate that possibility. Once sovereignty had been revoked, it was rarely returned. Even if a relative was installed, that new ruler operated under explicit Roman oversight. The independence that had defined the original monarchy no longer existed in the same form. And yet, Rome's policy was rarely impulsive. Emperors and generals evaluated each situation carefully. Would execution destabilize the province? Would mercy project confidence? Would public humiliation strengthen political standing in Rome? Each decision reflected calculation. Rome's leaders were not simply conquerors. They were managers of perception. This managerial mindset extended into historical writing. Roman historians shaped how future generations would understand these events. They framed certain queens as ambitious beyond measure, others as tragically misguided, others still as exotic and dangerous. These portrayals served Roman moral and political themes. In doing so, they reinforced the idea that Rome's intervention had been necessary and justified. At the same time, the survival of these queens in historical memory reminds us that punishment does not erase significance. Cleopatra remains one of the most studied figures of the ancient world. Zenobia is remembered as a formidable leader who briefly challenged imperial dominance. Their stories endure not because Rome failed to punish them, but because the very act of punishment elevated their historical visibility. From a broader historical perspective, Rome's treatment of captured queens reveals an empire deeply invested in control at every level: military, political, symbolic, and narrative. Victory was not complete until it was displayed. Authority was not secure until it was integrated. Legitimacy was not absolute until alternatives had been neutralized. So when we ask how Rome really punished captured queens, the answer is layered and deliberate. Rome stripped them of sovereignty, dismantled their power networks, absorbed their territories, reshaped their public image, and ensured that their future, if they had one, unfolded entirely within Roman boundaries. Sometimes this meant chains and procession. Sometimes it meant guarded villas and supervised assimilation. Sometimes it meant death. But always it meant transformation, and that transformation served a single enduring purpose: to affirm that in the Roman imagination, there could be many rulers, many crowns, many kingdoms, but only one ultimate authority. Rome did not merely defeat its rivals. It repositioned them within a world ordered by Roman power. In that sense, the punishment of captured queens was never only about the individuals themselves. It was about demonstrating that sovereignty outside Rome was conditional, temporary, and vulnerable. Through spectacle, policy, and memory, Rome made that lesson visible and ensured that it echoed far beyond the moment of capture. As we reach the closing perspective on this subject, it becomes clear that Rome's handling of captured queens reveals something essential about how empires preserve themselves. Rome did not simply overpower opponents. It absorbed, reframed, and reorganized them. A queen's capture marked the visible peak of a much deeper process, one that began long before the final battle and continued long after the public ceremony. In many cases, Roman involvement in a kingdom preceded open war. Diplomacy, trade agreements, military alliances, and advisory roles gradually drew regions into Rome's orbit. A queen who later resisted was often pushing back against years of increasing Roman influence. By the time she was captured, the conflict represented not a sudden clash, but the culmination of a slow contest over autonomy. Rome's punishment therefore functioned as a final consolidation of authority that had already been expanding. One of the most significant elements of that consolidation was time. Rome understood that immediate punishment created impact, but long-term control required endurance. A defeated queen might be displayed once, but the imperial presence remained daily, through governors, soldiers, tax collectors, engineers, and merchants. Roads connected former capitals to Rome's logistical network. Ports integrated regional economies into Mediterranean trade. Latin inscriptions appeared alongside local languages. Gradually, the political imagination of the territory shifted. Sovereignty no longer centered on a palace. It centered on an empire. There is also an important distinction between personal humiliation and structural transformation. Modern audiences sometimes focus on the spectacle, the chains, the triumph, the guarded exile. These moments were dramatic, but they were not the core of Roman punishment. The true objective was structural. Rome aimed to ensure that no rival power base could regenerate. That meant redistributing land ownership, co-opting local aristocrats, and embedding Roman legal norms. Even if popular memory honored the former queen, the institutional framework that supported her rule was gone. In this way, Rome's approach avoided certain long-term risks. By preventing the reemergence of independent dynasties, Rome reduced the likelihood of cyclical uprisings centered on royal restoration. A queen's removal was followed by a redefinition of governance itself. Over time, generations grew up knowing only the imperial structure. The memory of independent rule faded from lived experience into distant story. And yet, Rome's reliance on image never disappeared. Even as administrative systems solidified control, the empire continued to emphasize visible authority. Imperial portraits were placed in public spaces. Oaths of loyalty were sworn to the emperor. Victories were commemorated in art and architecture. The earlier defeat of a queen became part of this visual language. It was proof that Rome could confront formidable opposition and emerge unchallenged. At the same time, Rome's strategy reveals an awareness of complexity. Queens were not interchangeable figures. Each ruled within a distinct cultural, religious, and political environment. Roman leaders adjusted their responses accordingly. In regions where local traditions were deeply rooted, gradual integration might be preferred. In strategically vital territories, stronger military oversight followed immediately. The punishment of a queen therefore functioned within broader regional calculations. What stands out most clearly is that Rome rarely allowed captured queens to define the terms of their own legacy. Their stories were filtered through Roman priorities. Even praise could serve Roman ends, highlighting the scale of Rome's achievement. In absorbing their narratives, Rome strengthened its claim to universality. It presented itself as the final authority before which all others eventually stood. Yet history has a way of preserving complexity despite efforts to control it. The fact that we continue to study and discuss these queens suggests that their influence extended beyond Rome's framing. Their resistance, leadership, and strategic choices remain subjects of inquiry precisely because they intersected so dramatically with imperial expansion. Rome may have redefined their political status, but it could not entirely erase their significance. So when we calmly consider how Rome really punished captured queens, we see a method that combined ceremony with calculation, dominance with administration, and spectacle with long-term integration. Rome removed their crowns not only from their heads, but from the political systems that sustained them. It transformed sovereign rulers into symbols of Roman inevitability, and it ensured that the territories they once governed would operate within a structure where ultimate authority flowed toward Rome. In the end, the punishment was comprehensive but rarely chaotic. It was guided by a consistent objective: secure the empire, deter resistance, and reinforced the perception that Roman power was both justified and enduring. The captured queen became a moment in that larger story, a turning point where one political order gave way to another. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson. Rome's strength did not lie solely in military discipline or territorial expansion. It lay in its ability to convert victory into permanence. A queen's fall was not merely an episode of defeat. It was a demonstration that in the Roman world, sovereignty outside the empire could be challenged, absorbed, and ultimately redefined under Roman terms. If we take one final, steady look at the broader picture, Rome's punishment of captured queens ultimately reveals how the empire understood permanence. Rome did not think in terms of isolated victories. It thought in generations. The fall of a queen was not only about ending a rebellion in the present. It was about shaping how power would be imagined in that region for decades to come. A monarchy depends on continuity. It depends on the belief that a ruling house carries legitimacy forward through bloodlines, ritual, and recognition. When Rome captured a queen, it disrupted that continuity at its source. The dynasty could not proceed as it once had. Even if distant relatives survived, their authority was now mediated through Rome. By interrupting succession, Rome interrupted memory. The symbolic chain connecting past rulers to future heirs was broken or redirected. This mattered profoundly in societies where monarchy was intertwined with religion. In many kingdoms, the ruler was not simply a political administrator, but a sacred figure whose role helped maintain cosmic balance or divine favor. Rome did not need to publicly denounce these beliefs to weaken them. The visual fact of the queen's defeat performed the work quietly. If she had been favored by her gods, how had she fallen? If her dynasty was divinely protected, how had it been overtaken? The Roman triumph subtly suggested that a higher divine alignment stood with Rome. At the same time, Rome rarely sought to eradicate local religion altogether. Instead, it often practiced incorporation. Local gods were identified with Roman counterparts. Temples were maintained or rededicated. Religious continuity was allowed, but under imperial stability. The queen's removal signaled a transfer of ultimate protection. Rome did not need to abolish belief. It needed to stand above it. Economically, the consequences were equally transformative. Royal treasuries that once funded independent armies now contributed to imperial campaigns elsewhere. Grain supplies, mineral resources, and trade routes became components of a vast interconnected system. The captured queen's former wealth strengthened the very structure that had defeated her. In this way, punishment was self-reinforcing. Each conquest funded future security. There is also an important psychological layer within Rome itself. Roman citizens were accustomed to hearing of distant victories. The empire's scale required constant reassurance that its borders remained secure. The capture of a queen provided a narrative of decisive action. It suggested that even organized, charismatic opposition could be managed. In periods of internal tension, economic strain, political rivalry, or succession uncertainty, such stories reinforced unity. They reminded the Roman public that external order remained intact. And yet, Rome's leaders understood restraint. Excessive cruelty could create instability. A queen treated with calculated dignity, even in defeat, projected Roman confidence. It suggested that Rome did not fear former rivals. Clemency, when extended, was not equality. It was superiority expressed calmly. The empire preferred to appear inevitable rather than desperate. Over centuries, this approach shaped the political culture of the Mediterranean world. Rulers learned that open defiance of Rome carried consequences that extended beyond battlefield loss. It meant structural absorption. It meant narrative reframing. It meant the possibility that one's own legacy would be rewritten in another empire's language. Still, the endurance of certain names reminds us that power does not entirely erase identity. Cleopatra's political intelligence, Zenobia's military ambition, and other lesser-known queens' resistance efforts remain subjects of study because they momentarily disrupted Rome's expansion. Their punishment confirms Rome's dominance, but their memory confirms their significance. So, in the calmest and clearest terms, how did Rome really punish captured queens? It dismantled their sovereignty at every level: dynastic, political, economic, religious, and symbolic. It converted their defeat into proof of imperial order. It absorbed their territories into systems designed for longevity. And it ensured that their stories, whether critical or admiring, ultimately reinforced Rome's central position. The spectacle of chains or exile was only the surface. Beneath it lay a disciplined strategy aimed at permanence. Rome did not merely end rival rule. It replaced it with an enduring framework that extended far beyond the lifetime of any single ruler. And that is why these stories continue to matter. They show us how empires manage both power and perception. They reveal how sovereignty can be stripped not only by force, but by integration and reinterpretation. In the Roman world, the crown of a captured queen did not simply fall. It was absorbed into a system determined to ensure that no authority stood outside its reach. In that absorption, Rome demonstrated its defining strength: the ability to transform victory into structure and structure into memory. As we close this exploration, it is worth reflecting on the long shadow cast by Rome's treatment of captured queens. What appears at first glance to be a series of dramatic episodes, defeats, processions, exiles, reveals on closer examination a disciplined imperial method. Rome was not improvising cruelty. It was managing power. Every empire must answer the same question. What do you do with a rival whose authority carries emotional, political, and sacred weight? Rome's answer was consistent. You remove the rival's independence, redefine their identity, and integrate their world into your own system. A captured queen was not merely an enemy subdued. She was a political structure dismantled. The Roman state understood that sovereignty rests on recognition. A queen ruled because her people, her court, her military, and often her priesthood recognized her legitimacy. Once Rome severed those channels, once the army was defeated, the court dispersed, the treasury seized, and official recognition withdrawn, the foundation of rule collapsed. The queen might still live, but the system that sustained her no longer did. This structural approach also explains why Rome's punishment could appear measured rather than impulsive. There was rarely a need for chaotic destruction. Rome preferred controlled transition. A former capital city might continue functioning, but under a Roman governor. Trade continued, but under Roman taxation. Religious life persisted, but within a new hierarchy. Stability, not devastation, was often the long-term objective. In this context, public humiliation served a precise function. It was a visible marker of transfer. The triumph announced that authority had shifted. It reassured Roman citizens and warned distant rulers. But once that signal was sent, governance resumed with bureaucratic discipline. Rome excelled not only at conquest, but at administration. The fate of captured queens also underscores a broader truth about imperial psychology. Rome saw itself as the central axis of civilization. Foreign rulers existed along a spectrum of cooperation or resistance. When a queen resisted, her defeat reinforced the narrative that Rome's expansion was both natural and necessary. When she cooperated, her survival reinforced Rome's magnanimity. Either outcome affirmed Roman centrality. Yet the endurance of these queens in historical memory complicates the story. Rome intended to absorb and redefine them, but it also preserved their names within its own records. In doing so, it ensured they would not vanish entirely. Their defeats became case studies in imperial policy, but they also became reminders of the diverse political worlds that once stood alongside Rome. For modern observers, this layered reality offers a measured lesson. Power is rarely exercised in a single dramatic moment. It is secured through repetition, narrative, and institutional change. Rome's punishment of captured queens was effective not because it was always brutal, but because it was comprehensive. It addressed symbolism, structure, economy, and memory at once. So when we ask, calmly and without exaggeration, how Rome really punished captured queens, the answer is this: Rome removed their sovereignty in a way that prevented its return. It displayed their defeat to communicate dominance. It absorbed their territories to ensure stability. It reshaped their legacy to reinforce imperial ideology. And it did so with a long-term vision that prioritized endurance over spectacle alone. The crown, once a symbol of independent authority, became evidence of Rome's supremacy. The palace became a provincial center. The dynasty became history, and the queen herself, whether executed, exiled, or assimilated, became part of a larger imperial narrative designed to outlast any individual reign. In the quiet sweep of centuries, that strategy proved decisive. Rome's strength was not only in its legions, but in its ability to turn rivals into lessons and lessons into lasting order. Through ceremony, calculation, and integration, the empire ensured that even its most formidable opponents would ultimately stand as testimony to Roman power. And that is the deeper reality behind the spectacle. Rome did not simply punish captured queens. It transformed them into milestones along the road of imperial permanence, visible reminders that in the Roman world, sovereignty was never secure unless it aligned with Rome itself. There is one more quiet layer to consider, and it may be the most revealing of all. Rome's punishment of captured queens was not only about demonstrating strength to others. It was about reassuring Rome itself. The Roman state expanded across vast distances, ruling over peoples who spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and remembered their own histories of independence. Holding such a world together required more than armies. It required confidence. Confidence among senators, soldiers, merchants, and ordinary citizens that Rome's authority was stable and enduring. Each time a powerful foreign queen was defeated and displayed, that confidence was renewed. The symbolism operated on multiple levels. For a Roman citizen standing in the crowd during a triumph, the sight of a captured queen communicated something deeply reassuring. Even the highest and most distant rulers could be brought within Rome's control. Geography no longer limited Roman reach. Titles no longer shielded opponents. The world, in a sense, was manageable. At the same time, the emperor or general presiding over the event gained legitimacy. Victories against ordinary enemies were expected. Victories against monarchs, especially queens who had ruled in their own right, carried greater weight. They elevated the status of the victor and strengthened the perception that Rome's leadership was capable of confronting extraordinary challenges. Yet Rome's leaders were careful not to let triumph become excess. The Republic had once overthrown its own kings out of fear of concentrated power. Even under the Empire, that memory lingered. A victorious commander had to present himself as serving the state, not replacing it. The humiliation of a foreign queen reinforced this contrast. Rome did not submit to monarchs. It subdued them. There is also a long-term cultural effect to consider. Over time, as provinces stabilized and generations passed, former enemies became contributors to Roman life. Soldiers from once independent regions joined Roman legions. Provincial elites entered imperial administration. Cities flourished under trade networks that stretched from Britain to Syria. The memory of a defeated queen gradually shifted from immediate political threat to historical episode. This gradual shift reveals the final dimension of Rome's method: patience. Rome did not need to erase identity overnight. It needed to ensure that political authority flowed consistently in one direction. Once that flow was secured, through law, infrastructure, military presence, and economic integration, the dramatic punishment of a captured queen became a foundational story rather than an ongoing crisis. And so, if we step back once more, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Rome punished captured queens by removing their ability to command, by redirecting the resources of their kingdoms, by reshaping their public image, and by embedding their territories within an imperial structure designed to endure. The visible acts, parades, exile, guarded residence, or execution were tools within a broader architecture of control. What makes this history enduring is not only the drama of powerful women confronting a vast empire. It is the clarity with which Rome approached the problem of sovereignty. Rival authority could not simply be defeated. It had to be transformed. Independent crowns had to become dependent symbols or vanish into administrative order. In that transformation lies the true answer. Rome's punishment was comprehensive but calculated, symbolic but strategic. It did not rely solely on fear. nor solely on mercy. It combined both within a disciplined system aimed at permanence. And that permanence is perhaps the empire's most defining achievement. Long after the triumphal arches weathered and the legions withdrew from distant frontiers, the stories of captured queens remained as markers of how Rome asserted itself. They remind us that empires are sustained not only by force of arms, but by control of narrative, by institutional depth, and by the steady reshaping of political reality. In the Roman world, a queen could rise, command, and challenge. But once captured, her fate would be folded into a larger design, one that ensured Rome, not any rival throne, stood at the center of power. As we settle into the final stretch of this story, it helps to pause and consider something broader than any single queen or single emperor. Rome's treatment of captured queens reflects how the empire understood history itself. Rome did not see events as isolated episodes. It saw them as steps in a continuous expansion of order. Every victory had to fit into that larger arc. Every defeated ruler had to be positioned within that unfolding narrative. When a queen was captured, Rome was not only ending her reign, it was absorbing her timeline into its own. Her kingdom's past, its alliances, its wars, its internal struggles became prelude. Its future became provincial history. The decisive turning point was Roman intervention. From that moment forward, local chronology aligned with imperial chronology. Dates were recorded according to Roman consuls or emperors. Official acts were validated through Roman authority. Time itself, in administrative terms, shifted orientation. That shift matters. Sovereignty is partly about defining the rhythm of political life, when laws are issued, when festivals are held, when succession occurs. Once Rome controlled those rhythms, independent monarchy could not truly return. Even if cultural memory preserved the idea of former queens, the practical mechanisms of rule had changed. Governors answered to Rome. Taxes moved through imperial channels. Military defense followed Roman command structures. The queen's removal symbolized this transition, but the deeper reality was institutional permanence. It is also important to understand that Rome's leaders studied precedent. They were aware of earlier conquests and earlier mistakes. Harsh repression could generate instability. Excessive leniency could invite defiance. Over time, Roman policy toward captured royalty developed into a flexible but recognizable pattern. Remove the sovereign authority, control the narrative, stabilize the territory, and incorporate local elites where possible. Queens were treated within this framework because they represented concentrated sovereignty. Cleopatra's defeat signaled the end of Hellenistic independence in Egypt and the beginning of direct Roman control over one of the Mediterranean's wealthiest regions. Zenobia's capture reaffirmed imperial unity during a time of fragmentation. In both cases, the fate of the queen carried weight far beyond personal loss. It marked structural transformation within the empire. And yet, Rome rarely described its actions as destruction. Official language emphasized restoration, restoration of order, restoration of peace, restoration of rightful governance. This vocabulary softened the reality of conquest. It framed Roman expansion as corrective rather than aggressive. The punishment of a queen thus became an act of stabilization within Roman rhetoric. At the same time, the Roman public expected visible proof of dominance. Coins commemorated victories. Reliefs depicted bound captives in stylized form. Public monuments listed conquered peoples. These images were not random decoration. They were visual policy statements. They reinforced the lesson that resistance had consequences and that Rome stood above competing claims to authority. From the perspective of neighboring rulers, the message was unmistakable. Cooperation preserved limited autonomy. Defiance risked absorption. Queens who governed client states understood this balance clearly. They operated within a narrow corridor of independence, aware that stepping beyond it could trigger irreversible intervention. But Rome's strategy also depended on continuity at home. The empire needed administrative talent, military loyalty, and economic stability to sustain expansion. The spectacle of captured royalty contributed to that continuity by strengthening collective identity. It reassured Roman citizens that their system, whatever its internal disputes, remained dominant on the world stage. Over centuries, this disciplined approach allowed Rome to manage a vast and diverse empire with remarkable durability. Not every province was peaceful. Not every decision was flawless. Yet the core method, defeat, display, integrate, proved adaptable. Queens, because of their symbolic significance, became some of the most visible examples of that method in action. So when we quietly ask, after all this examination, how Rome really punished captured queens, the answer is both simple and layered. Rome ended their independent authority, ensured that their power structures could not regenerate, incorporated their territories into imperial systems, and reframed their legacies within Roman storytelling. Whether through triumphal humiliation, strategic mercy, or administrative absorption, the outcome was consistent. Sovereignty shifted permanently toward Rome. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson behind these histories. Power is rarely secured by force alone. It is secured by redefining the landscape in which power operates. Rome mastered that redefinition. A queen who once stood at the center of her own political universe found herself repositioned within a far larger design. One that prioritized continuity, order, and imperial permanence above all else. In the Roman world, crowns could be worn, challenged, and lost, but ultimate authority belonged to the empire. And when that authority was challenged, Rome responded not only with legions, but with structure, spectacle, and a long memory that ensured the lesson would last far beyond the fall of any single throne. As we bring this final layer into focus, it becomes clear that Rome's punishment of captured queens was part of something even larger than imperial expansion. It was part of Rome's effort to define the boundaries of political possibility. In the Roman imagination, there could be many local rulers, many cultures, many traditions, but there could not be an enduring rival center of power equal to Rome itself. When a queen emerged as a figure capable of mobilizing armies, shaping alliances, and commanding loyalty across regions, she represented more than opposition. She represented an alternative model of authority. Her court functioned as a diplomatic hub. Her treasury financed campaigns. Her lineage anchored continuity. Rome could tolerate such authority only as long as it aligned with Roman interests. Once it did not, the conflict became existential, not necessarily in terms of survival, but in terms of hierarchy. The Roman response, therefore, was designed to settle hierarchy decisively. Capture was the turning point. From that moment, the queen ceased to operate within her own political universe. She entered Rome's. Her identity was recategorized, from sovereign to captive, from decision-maker to dependent, from origin of law to subject of law. This shift was not symbolic alone. It was codified through legal acts, decrees, and administrative reassignments. In many cases, the lands once governed by a queen were surveyed and reorganized with striking precision. Roman engineers mapped territories for taxation. Military roads connected strategic cities. Provincial boundaries were drawn or adjusted. The physical landscape itself began to reflect Roman logic. Over time, this spatial transformation reinforced political transformation. Geography that had once revolved around a royal center now revolved around imperial infrastructure. And yet Rome did not always erase local elites. In fact, one of its most effective strategies was co-option. Prominent families were offered roles within provincial councils or even paths to Roman citizenship. The removal of a queen could open space for ambitious local leaders willing to align themselves with imperial power. This redirection of loyalty prevented power vacuums. It turned potential resistance into partnership. But for the queen herself, the experience was profoundly narrowing. Even in cases where she was spared and allowed to live in Italy, her existence unfolded under surveillance and limitation. She was physically present but politically absent. Her survival depended on Rome's continued tolerance. This condition, living without sovereignty, was a powerful statement. It demonstrated that Rome could afford mercy because it no longer feared competition. The Roman public, meanwhile, absorbed these stories into collective memory. Triumphs were recorded in inscriptions. Historians chronicled victories. Children grew up hearing of distant rulers subdued and territories secured. The repetition of these narratives built a psychological framework in which Roman dominance seemed natural, almost inevitable. A captured queen was one chapter in a much larger epic of expansion. At the same time, Rome's leaders understood that dominance required maintenance. Frontier pressures persisted. Internal rivalries occasionally destabilized the center. In such moments, recalling earlier victories, especially over formidable monarchs, reinforced the legitimacy of current authority. The punishment of past queens became part of a repertoire of reassurance. It reminded citizens that Rome had faced significant challenges before and prevailed. Looking back with measured distance, we can see that Rome's true strength lay not simply in conquest but in consolidation. Defeating a queen was an event. Ensuring that her defeat translated into durable control was a process. That process included ceremony, law, economics, urban planning, and narrative framing. It was deliberate and sustained. So in answering the question one final time, how did Rome really punish captured queens? We arrive at a conclusion rooted in structure rather than spectacle. Rome removed their autonomy, dismantled their power networks, integrated their territories into imperial systems, and absorbed their legacy into Roman history. It ensured that the authority they once embodied could not reemerge outside Roman oversight. The visible elements, chains in a procession, guarded villas, confiscated treasures, were only the outer layer. Beneath them lay administrative permanence and narrative control. Through this layered approach, Rome transformed moments of rebellion into long-term reinforcement of imperial order. And that is perhaps the most enduring insight. Empires sustain themselves not only by defeating opponents, but by reshaping the world those opponents once governed. Rome mastered that reshaping. A captured queen did not simply fall from power. She became proof of a hierarchy in which Rome defined the limits of sovereignty. In the calm passage of centuries, that strategy left a mark far beyond the lives of any individual ruler. It established a model of imperial authority that relied on visibility, calculation, and institutional depth. And through the stories of those queens, remembered, debated, and studied even now, we can still see how Rome turned personal defeat into enduring political design. If we sit with this subject just a little longer, one final insight begins to surface. Rome's punishment of captured queens was not only a strategy of domination. It was a way of teaching the empire and the world beyond it how power was supposed to function. Rome presented itself as the guarantor of order. In Roman political thought, disorder came from fragmentation, from rival centers of authority competing for loyalty. A queen who ruled independently outside Roman control represented precisely that kind of fragmentation. When she resisted, Rome framed the conflict not simply as a war of expansion, but as a restoration of balance. The punishment that followed was therefore designed to look corrective rather than chaotic. This framing mattered deeply. Rome did not want to appear arbitrary. It wanted to appear lawful. Even acts of conquest were often wrapped in legal language. Treaties broken, alliances violated, stability threatened. By defining the conflict in procedural terms, Rome gave itself justification. The captured queen became the embodiment of a problem that had now been resolved. But resolution required visibility. In the Roman world, sight carried authority. Public ritual was not decorative, it was political communication. When a queen was displayed in a triumph, Rome was not indulging cruelty for its own sake. It was demonstrating that hierarchy had been clarified. The ambiguity of conflict was over. There was no lingering doubt about who ruled. Yet Rome also understood that spectacle fades. Crowds disperse. Applause quiets. What remains is structure. That is why the administrative phase was so critical. After the queen's capture, officials moved quickly to stabilize the region. Garrisons were placed in strategic locations. Tax systems were standardized. Communication routes were secured. These measures ensured that her former authority could not quietly reassemble in her absence. In many cases, Rome also reshaped local identity in subtle ways. Cities might receive new names honoring emperors. Civic institutions were reorganized according to Roman municipal models. Local elites were drawn into imperial networks, sometimes receiving Roman citizenship. Over time, loyalty shifted not necessarily from love, but from practicality. Rome offered access to trade, protection, and advancement. The memory of independent monarchy gradually receded behind the realities of imperial life. It is important to acknowledge that this process was not uniform. Some regions remained resistant for generations. Some memories of lost sovereignty endured strongly. But Rome's consistency in handling captured royalty reduced the chances of immediate reversal. By preventing the return of a deposed queen or the restoration of her dynasty, Rome removed the most direct symbol around which rebellion could gather. And still, there is an irony woven through this history. The very act of punishing powerful queens ensured their survival in historical memory. Roman writers recorded their names because their defeats were significant. Monuments depicted their submission because it magnified Roman glory. In attempting to subordinate them, Rome preserved them. Their stories became inseparable from Rome's own narrative. From our perspective today, this layered reality invites reflection rather than simple judgment. Rome operated within a world where sovereignty was contested through force, alliance, and ritual. Its methods were harsh by modern standards, yet internally consistent. The punishment of captured queens followed a recognizable logic. Remove the rival center of authority, secure the territory, project dominance, and integrate the region into a system designed for longevity. So when we ask, one last time, how Rome really punished captured queens, the answer rests not in a single dramatic image but in a sequence of deliberate actions. Rome stripped them of independence, converted their defeat into public proof of hierarchy, reorganized their lands under imperial administration, and reshaped their legacy within Roman storytelling. It balanced intimidation with calculation, severity with strategy. The crown that once symbolized autonomous rule did not simply disappear. It was absorbed into a broader imperial order. And through that absorption, Rome reinforced its central claim that stability, legitimacy, and lasting power flowed outward from Rome itself. In the end, the fate of these queens tells us as much about Rome as it does about them. It reveals an empire determined not only to conquer, but to define the meaning of conquest. Through spectacle and system, through law and memory, Rome ensured that even its most formidable rivals would stand as testimony to its enduring authority. And in that enduring authority, the empire found its greatest strength, not merely in winning battles, but in shaping the world that followed them. As we ease into the final reflections, it's worth considering how Rome's treatment of captured queens fits into the broader rhythm of ancient power. In the ancient Mediterranean world, legitimacy was fragile. It depended on military success, religious validation, elite support, and public perception. A ruler who lost a decisive war often lost everything. Rome did not invent this reality, but it refined it into policy. What made Rome distinct was its consistency. When a queen was captured, her fate was folded into a predictable imperial sequence. First came the military resolution, then came the symbolic display, whether through triumph or formal announcement. After that came administrative absorption. Each stage reinforced the previous one. The battlefield established dominance. The spectacle communicated it. The bureaucracy secured it. In many cases, the queen's physical removal was less important than the message it carried. Even before she was transported to Rome or confined to guarded quarters, news of her defeat traveled rapidly through trade routes and military channels. Provincial leaders, neighboring monarchs, and client rulers received the signal. Rome had acted. The outcome was clear. Political calculation shifted accordingly. There is also a subtle dimension of gender at play in these episodes. Female rulers in the ancient world were often scrutinized more intensely than their male counterparts. Roman writers sometimes portrayed them as exceptional, either dangerously ambitious or remarkably capable. This framing heightened the drama of their capture. By defeating a queen who had commanded authority in her own right, Rome underscored its ability to overcome even unconventional centers of power. Yet Rome's strategy did not rely on mockery alone. In certain cases, a degree of respect was preserved in the record. A formidable opponent could enhance Roman prestige by contrast. If a queen was intelligent, disciplined, or strategically gifted, her defeat appeared even more impressive. This careful balance between criticism and acknowledgement strengthened Rome's narrative of inevitability. Economically, the removal of a queen often meant the redirection of wealth. Royal treasuries funded Roman projects. Agricultural regions once controlled by local courts supplied imperial markets. Strategic ports became nodes in Rome's trade network. The resources that had supported independent policy now strengthened the empire that had absorbed them. This economic reorientation was one of the most enduring consequences of conquest. Culturally, the shift unfolded more gradually. Local traditions persisted. Languages continued. Religious practices adapted. But over time, Roman law, architecture, and civic organization left visible marks. Amphitheaters rose where royal compounds once dominated. Latin inscriptions appeared in public squares. The symbols of monarchy were replaced by the symbols of empire. The captured queen's absence became part of the landscape's transformation. For Rome, this transformation justified the initial severity. Punishment was not an end in itself. It was a means to secure alignment. Once a territory was stable within imperial structures, the dramatic memory of its former queen receded into history. Rome preferred predictable provinces over perpetual rebellion. And yet, in a quiet way, the stories of these queens continue to challenge simple narratives. They remind us that Rome's expansion was not inevitable from the perspective of those who resisted it. Each queen represented a genuine alternative vision of sovereignty, whether Hellenistic, Near Eastern, or regional in character. Their capture marked the triumph of one political model over another. So in answering the question with final clarity, how did Rome really punish captured queens? We return to the layered truth. Rome removed their autonomy, dismantled their dynastic continuity, redirected their resources, reshaped their territories, and reframed their stories. Sometimes the punishment was immediate and visible. Sometimes it unfolded quietly through administration and assimilation. But in every case, the outcome served a consistent purpose, reinforcing Roman centrality. The spectacle of triumph may linger in imagination, the image of a once sovereign ruler walking beneath foreign arches. But the deeper reality was structural. Rome ensured that independent monarchy could not easily reconstitute itself once challenged and subdued. It turned moments of resistance into foundations of imperial order. And that, ultimately, is why these stories endure. They reveal the mechanics of empire in motion. They show how authority is transferred, how legitimacy is redefined, and how political systems secure longevity. In the Roman world, the fall of a queen was not only a personal tragedy or a dramatic event. It was a signal that sovereignty had shifted, and that Rome stood firmly at the center of that shift.